We are happy to welcome Chad Bishop to the show from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He, of course, covers Georgia Tech. Chad, thanks for joining us here today.
Well, thanks for having me. It actually probably feels a little bit like South Bend in Atlanta this week. It's in the low 60s and thought about turning my heat on, man. I don't know. You guys are bringing the cold weather down with you.
I tell you what, I guess so. And it's been like 40s and 50s up here already this week. It's like fall really hit us full force over the last week or so.
Right in the face. That's right. Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, there's a lot of stuff to get into with Georgia Tech. I did want to start with Brent Key, the head coach. This is his second full season. Of course, he took over as the interim coach when Jeff Collins was fired fairly early in 2022. I'm curious, because we don't see Georgia Tech very often. Was he a popular hire when they ultimately made him the head coach?
Yeah. I think in the moment, for context, Brent Key took over, like you said, early 22 as the interim coach. Former Georgia Tech offensive lineman, bleeds gold and white. I mean, loves Georgia Tech with all his heart. Led Georgia Tech to some wins, in 2002 as interim coach, and the team seemed to rally behind him. There was a social media push for him. But I think on the flip side, right, like anytime a program promotes the interim coach, I feel like oftentimes it ends up not being the right move. I mean, you look like a Dabo Swinney at Clemson, like that's a dream come true for those folks. But more often than not, it's the easy hire. It's the right hire at the time. But as time goes on, it doesn't really play out. I don't think that's been the case with Brent Key. I mean, he has really dug in deep. He's been training for this opportunity his whole life. I think there was thinking that he could have taken over at Central Florida for O'Leary when O'Leary's time at UCF was done. He didn't get that job, moves on to Alabama to be an assistant under Nick Saban. So he's been training to be a head coach for a long, long time. And this job, was sort of right place, right time. And he's taken it by the reins and really has this program moving in a great direction. 7-6 last year and won a bowl game.
Right.
Sitting at 5-2 here in 2024 with a brutal schedule ahead, but they're looking pretty stout so far in 2024.
Well, like you said, they have improved, and I realized they were, like with Collins, they were coming out of the Paul Johnson option era, like transition, basically transitioning to a modern offense. Is that maybe why it's worked out a little bit better for Collins in the short term, or other reasons, to kind of go along with it? Why do you think it has worked out a little bit better for him, it seems like?
From an outsider's perspective, I think so. I've only been covering Georgia Tech since 2023, so I missed the entire Jeff Collins era. But I think there is something to be said for being the guy that follows the guy, right? And Paul Johnson won a ton of games and championships and bowl games, triple option offense. Now, Jeff Collins did not do himself any favors. He didn't really endear himself to the fan base, and sort of had some cheeky bravado about him that rubbed people the wrong way, and went out and lost a ton of games and lost badly. Lost a game to Notre Dame, 55-0, and lost to Georgia 41-0, and just was not competitive a lot of the times. So I think from that perspective, it wasn't hard for Brent Key to go up because they were pretty down low at the bottom, right? But that being said, Brent Key has clearly changed the culture, given this team an identity, and they're beating good teams. They're beating ranked opponents. They're winning home now. They got to start putting wins back to back to back to back. If they do that, they got a chance to maybe creep in the top 25 and compete for ACC championships.
You mentioned the 5-2 coming into this game, very obviously more than respectable right now. Have they exceeded your expectations to this point?
It's interesting. The Las Vegas win total was 5.5. I think they were picked 9th, I want to say, in the preseason ACC poll. I thought that was a little low. I thought this team had a chance to win 8 games. The problem was the schedule going into the preseason, playing number 10 Florida State. Clearly not number 10 anymore.
No.
Playing what they thought would be a ranked North Carolina team. They've kind of fallen off. Nobody expected Duke, to be undefeated when Georgia Tech played them, but they had to play the defending ACC runner-ups in Louisville. They still have to play Georgia. They still have to play Notre Dame. They still have to play Miami. They thought NC State at home on a Thursday night was going to be a really, really tough game. So week in and week out, they've had a real tough schedule. We haven't even mentioned Syracuse, who's been barn burners to this point with Kyle McCord, have been an outstanding football team. So, I thought it would certainly be a struggle for them to get over that 6-7 win mark. but they're trending in the right direction. Lost 2 games by a total of 15 points, 3 on the road at Syracuse and 12 on the road at Louisville. So they're a few plays away from being undefeated. Now, that being said, they miss a field goal in Ireland. They lose to Florida State, and they could, easily be 4-3 or 3-4 at this point. So they're a team that wins close games. They play 60 minutes. They're going to grind it out and drag it out. Likely not going to blow a lot of teams out. Likely not going to get blown out by a lot of teams. And that's where they are right now. But they've found a way to win, and that's the mark of a veteran team, which is what they have this year.
You talk about that win over Florida State, and obviously it looks different now. They're far from a top 10 team, but still, I've got to think, regardless, for Georgia Tech to beat Florida State, that's still got to be really important for them. Anytime you can beat Florida State, especially to start off the season.
Yeah, I think it was, and just the way that they did it, right? Like winning on a last-second kick and fighting some adversity, doing it in a foreign country, with College Game Day there against the defending ACC champions. I mean, there were a lot of eyeballs on that game, and Georgia Tech played its type of football. Like I said, grind it out, play for 60 minutes, play a close game, and win at the end. And I think they knew going in that they had a good chance to win, but I think it was a proving point to show the rest of the ACC and the rest of the country that, Georgia Tech was good in 23, and they're going to be good again in 24. And here's a proving point to say, hey, they can play with almost anybody on their schedule. Again, we thought Florida State would be a lot better than they were, but at the time it was like, man, look at this Georgia Tech team. They have a real chance to do some special things.
Okay, so the $1 million question for this game is, of course, the quarterback, Haynes King. He left last week's game against North Carolina, had a shoulder injury, and some conflicting, what exactly, as of right now, is Haynes King's status for this week's game?
My personal opinion is probably doubtful. I think officially from the program is day-to-day. Brent Key was on the local radio on Monday, said he's day-to-day. We talked to him on Tuesday, said the same thing, day-to-day. We were still allowed into practice. We were still allowed to watch him. He was still, in his regular green quarterback jersey, going through quarterback drills, doing the things Haynes King normally does. But he didn't play that entire fourth quarter. His shoulder looked pretty banged up. We don't know what the injury is, whether it's a shoulder or an upper body or maybe, a rib or whatever the case may be. So I don't know. It's sort of a tough scenario because this is a non-conference game for Georgia Tech. I'm not indicating they would rest a player just because they have conference games coming up, because this is a huge opportunity for them. But Haynes King has he's a bright future. He's a kid that wants to play in the NFL. And you kind of look at the big picture of things and you say, well, if he can miss one game and being completely healthy the rest of the way, is that the gamble, right? Or do you throw him back out there in hopes of beating Notre Dame and maybe he injures it further? So I truly think they're going to take it day by day, see how he practices, see how he feels. It could lead all the way up to kickoff where he just says, I can't do this, right? It's not working, and we got to put the backup in. Now, the good thing for Tech is Zach Pyron, the backup, is not a kid. He's been in the program 3 years. He led this team to a win at Virginia Tech in 2022. He's played a lot of football, especially this year. They call him the touchdown vulture because they get in the red zone, they hand him the ball, and he scores from 3 yards out almost, every time. So he knows the offense. He's not going to come in there scared, especially playing in Atlanta. So they sort of have, I'm not going to say the best of both worlds, but it's not the end of the world if Haynes King doesn't play. They have a solid backup in Zach Pyron.
So I'll come back to Pyron, but I want to go back to what you were talking about, the fact that you got to actually see a little bit of practice. And so was King, when he was throwing, did he look comfortable throwing? Did it look like it was bothering him a lot?
He didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look comfortable. I mean, he just looked like Haynes King. And the portions of practice we get to see, they're not running team drills. They're not airing the ball out. They're not really going 1,000% full speed.
First part of kind of warm up still. That
yeah,
kind of thing.
Yeah, sort of that stuff. But the fact that he's out there, in uniform with a helmet, I think is a good sign for Georgia Tech. Again, I really think they're going to play this very, very cautiously and take it day by day, practice by practice.
It's curious, like you guys get to actually see in-season practice. Is that pretty common?
Yep. Every Tuesday and Wednesday we're allowed in for the first 4 periods of practice. It's not an unwritten rule. It's a pretty strict rule. You can go in there and watch. Just don't leave and say, hey, I saw so-and-so broke his leg. And as long as you don't do that, as a member of the media and tweet pictures of guys who are on crutches or whatever, as long as you're respectful and watch some things, it helps you down the line, right? Like if I were to go to practice on a Tuesday and see a kid in a walking boot, come Saturday, someone says, why isn't so-and-so playing? Well, he's out. I saw him at practice earlier in the week. So it's a give and take from the program. Brent Key trusts us as members of the media, and we appreciate that being allowed in there, week in and week out to see what's going on.
So what would you say is the biggest difference between Pyron and King then?
Experience. Haynes King was at Texas A&M for 3 years, played a ton of football there, came to Georgia Tech in January of 23 and won the starting job in August of 23. And he started every game since, 20 games for the Yellow Jackets, has played almost every single snap. And I'd say probably 95% of the snaps he's been available since he stepped on campus for the Yellow Jackets. So I think that's what it comes down to. Again, Zach Pyron's played some football too. I think I tallied he's been in 16 games for Georgia Tech, but not, for a full 60 minutes, right? Except for that game at Virginia Tech in 2022. So if you look at it from that standpoint, if Zach Pyron were to play Saturday against Notre Dame, he's taking that first snap, he's taking that last snap. It's a massive crowd. It's a huge atmosphere. It's on ESPN against the number 12 team in the country. That's where the intangibles come in, right? So I think that would be one of the main differences. Outside of that, man, both kids run the ball extremely well. Haynes King maybe has a better arm slightly, but I mean, they were both recruited to Georgia Tech for a reason. They're both good quarterbacks, and I think the coaching staff firmly believes in Zach Pyron, and that's why he stuck around, even though he knew he wasn't going to be the starting quarterback going into this year.
All right. So I mean, it sounds like, and it just kind of looking at what he's done in the past, like you expect, like from a running standpoint, all those kind of things, probably not too much difference between the two.
Yeah, and I actually think, I saw, Marcus Freeman gave a quote on Monday to the same thing. Like their offense really, Georgia Tech's offense, they're not going to go from throwing the ball 50 times a game to running it 50 times a game on Saturday against Notre Dame, no matter who the quarterback is. There's a lot of quarterback reads and some quarterback draws, a lot of short passes, a lot of screens, a lot of play action. They still want to run the ball with running back Jamal Haynes and run it effectively, have a great offensive line. So the quarterback is extremely important, but it's not the end-all be-all for this offense.
Well, I had to do a double take when I was looking. They've only given up 1 sack so far this year. I mean, is that you talked about the line? Is that mostly because of the line, or is it in combination with the fact that you do have a quarterback who can run out of some trouble?
It's a combination. I mean, Buster Faulkner, the offensive coordinator, and Chris Winkie, the quarterback's coach, they do a great job of getting the ball out. Georgia Tech has 2 great wide receivers, and Eric Singleton and Malik Rutherford. They have a great running back in Jamal Haynes and a veteran offensive line. 4 out of those 5 guys played on the team last year on the offensive front. So they do an outstanding job of protecting the quarterback, but also a ton of quick passes, ton of quick short passes, a lot of play action. And Haynes King is really, really smart at getting rid of the ball and not taking those sacks. And the only sack he took, he scrambled and got tackled for about a half-yard loss on that sack. So it's a combination of all the things, of everybody understanding in this offense how to get rid of the ball, how to not take those sacks, how to run with it, when you have to, calling design runs, keeping the defense off balance. And it's worked so far to fruition.
Jamal Haynes, he's rushed for almost 300 yards in the last 2 games alone. And again, kind of looking at what he had done, he had been fairly average through the first 5 games of the season. How's this switch kind of flipped for him the last couple games?
Yeah, a big thing there for Jamal Haynes is the bye week. Georgia Tech played, 5 straight games to start the season with no break. And he was a little banged up coming out of fall camp. I don't know if it was a foot injury or an ankle injury or both. He clearly was not 100%. So that's number one. I think the bye week allowed him to kick that foot up, rest a little bit, get it 100% healthy, give him a little bit more confidence. Number 2, Georgia Tech really hasn't had a true backup running back. Chad Alexander is probably the main guy. He's a former walk-on who's got a scholarship this season. Trey Cooley, who's a transfer originally from Louisville, has hardly played at all in his backup running back role. So a lot of defenses were saying, hey, if Jamal Haynes is in the backfield, he's probably getting the ball. And they've stuffed the box and they've stuffed the run and really shut him down. Now that Chad Alexander is back healthy as the backup running back, that's changed some things. Now that Georgia Tech has tweaked the offensive line a little bit in terms of, how they line up and who's where, that has helped as well. But the biggest thing is Jamal Haynes being healthy. And the kid is a fire plug. He's really tough. And if anybody didn't see that run against North Carolina, just one of the all-timers breaking a 68-yarder with 16 seconds left to win the game. Pretty remarkable stuff, and the kid is a really, really good running back.
When I was curious, I only got to see a little bit of their game against Louisville a few weeks back, and they ended up losing that game. I mean, King had his best passing game of the season just in terms of yardage, but they only scored 19 points in that game. I mean, did it just come down to the fact that they didn't run the ball well enough, or what do you? Because they didn't turn the ball over a lot either.
Yeah, that was part of it. I think there was some extra things at play in that one. I mentioned them playing 5 games in a row to start the year. Georgia Tech having to fly to Ireland and back, having to fly to Syracuse and back, having to go up to Louisville. And it was about 1,000 degrees that day in Louisville. I don't know if that's the official reading, but man, it was one of the hotter games I can ever remember. So not making excuses for the Yellow Jackets, but I think they were a little bit worn down. They gave up a defensive touchdown. They gave up a special teams touchdown on a block kick for a return for 6. You could just tell they were not on top of their game for whatever reason. And like we mentioned earlier, Louisville defensively did a great job of stuffing the run and daring Haynes King to pass, which he did. But when that offense is not balanced, when it's one-dimensional, like a lot of offenses, it's not going to be great. So I think that allowed Georgia Tech going into the bye week after that loss to Louisville say, okay, we can't let this happen anymore. Let's switch some things around on the offensive line, the way we're doing things. Let's develop our backup running backs a little bit more. Let's be a little bit more balanced on offense. And that showed in that Duke game and showed in that North Carolina game, and they've been rolling ever since.
Well, if I remember right, that was a noon game too, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. 3:30. Oh no, noon. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking that was one of those. I watched a little bit before I went over to Notre Dame, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Noon road games and all those kind of things. Those are I think those are always a crapshoot, no matter what. Defensively, they got a new defensive coordinator, obviously, this season. Tyler Santucci came over from Duke. He coached under Mike Elko, obviously, even going back to Texas A&M. How significant has that move been for them this season?
Huge. And of course, ironically, Notre Dame faced Duke last year. And so
Right.
Tyler Santucci prepared for Notre Dame last year. Asked Brent Key about that this week, and he said that really isn't too big of a factor, really, either way. Georgia Tech also brought over Jess Simpson from the Duke staff to coach the defensive line. So those two combined have been huge. Georgia Tech's defense was really bad in 2023, especially against the pass, especially on third down. Could not really stop anybody. And you flip it over to 2024, one of the best rush defenses in the ACC, one of the better defenses in the entire conference overall. They're playing really, really good defense. They have a lot more depth. I don't think their talent level is where it needs to be by any stretch of the imagination. But again, that they have so much depth now compared to last year. They can rotate a lot of guys in. They're tackling a lot better. They're not getting a ton of sacks. They're not getting a ton of turnovers right now. But they're keeping guys off the scoreboard. Really, that's what it comes down to at the end of the game. At the end of the day, is keeping guys off the scoreboard. They've done a fantastic job of that. And the biggest thing is they've stopped the run week in and week out, and that's been really huge for them.
Well, yeah, and I mean, again, just looking at their numbers, those things stood out as well. Lack of sacks, lack of really forcing. Is it just kind of a scrappy? Like, how would you describe it?
Yeah, that's a good word for it. And I think sort of their MO is, of course, they want sacks, right? And of course, they want takeaways. And they got 2 takeaways, at North Carolina. But the way this defensive line operates, it's more of a defensive line that sort of clogs the line of scrimmage, right? And lets the linebackers and DBs make some plays. So you don't have like an NFL-type pass rusher on this team. You don't really have a kid that's going to get back there and, get 10 to 15 sacks a season. They have a great defensive tackle in Jordan Vandenberg, who transferred from Penn State. But outside of that, it's by committee. They rotate, 6, 7, 8 guys in there playing and play out to try to stay fresh and neutralize the other team's offensive line. And so, yeah, there's not maybe a huge sack number, not a lot of tackles for loss, but those linebackers and DBs are in better position because there's not many people, to navigate through it, the offensive line at the line of scrimmage. And I think that's sort of how they've understood that their identity is going to be this year, and they've taken it and run with it.
They did give up over 200 rushing yards to the Tar Heels last week in that game, and North Carolina quarterback Jacoby Criswell played a pretty good part in that. I think he had around 70 or so yards and a couple touchdowns on the ground. Like, is that like? Do you see that mobile quarterback being a big factor potentially.
Yeah, it could be.
With Riley Leonard, obviously, this week.
Yeah, and they were also facing, Amari and Hampton, one of the best running backs in the country, who broke off a 70-yarder at one point and had another big gain that was called back for an offensive penalty on UNC. So there were some gaps there from that Georgia Tech run defense, really for the first time all year. The interesting thing about North Carolina and Jacoby Criswell, he's not necessarily known as a running quarterback, but he had some lanes, So I'll be interested to see if Notre Dame takes note of that and says, hey, look what Criswell did for UNC. Let's see if we can get Riley out there. Interesting, again, that Tyler Santucci, the former defensive coordinator at Duke, obviously was on the same roster as Riley Leonard, and now they have to go against each other on Saturday. I'm sure Tyler Santucci and his defensive staff are aware that could be an option with Riley Leonard, that he's going to pull the ball down and run, and they'll have a game plan for it. Of course, the trick, right, is not selling out on stopping Riley Leonard in the ground game and staying packed in the defensive secondary. So that'll be a huge issue for Georgia Tech to see if they can handle that for 4 quarters.
Yeah, and this is like going back to Notre Dame playing Texas A&M and Elko at the beginning of the season. So it's kind of the second time, that Notre Dame maybe has seen something along those lines. So it's going to be like just the sort of the chess pieces, I think, are going to be interesting to see how that lays out this Saturday.
For sure. Another, cool note about it is, Brent Key, his first game as a player, as a redshirt freshman, was at Notre Dame.
Oh, wow.
And so, there's a lot of connections between these two programs. And, these days, I think, us in the media, we make probably more about it. Like, this coach was here and that coach was there and that guy transferred to that school. But, rosters change and schemes change. And guys, like you mentioned, chess. I mean, guys are always moving pieces to try to find an edge there. I think I'm really fascinated to see what Tyler Santucci's defense does against Riley Leonard and company.
Yeah, I mean, with the transfer portal now, it's going to be more rare that you don't kind of see familiar faces, I think, every year, just the way things have gone.
Yep.
All right, Chad Bishop from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, again, covering Georgia Tech as Notre Dame heads down to Atlanta this weekend to take on the Yellow Jackets. Chad, again, appreciate it. Great stuff. Thanks for doing this.
Bye.